Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Leanne Tollison. Today we're exploring a real-world leadership case study from a combat zone, one involving technical integrity, data reliability, and the consequences of leadership refusing to listen. We're joined by Tkacz, a computer science graduate from Coastal Carolina University who deployed to Iraq in 2007 to support a prominent intelligence system used to aggregate and distribute mission-critical battlefield information. Back in the United States Army, civilians and contractors at Fort Monmouth had built an exceptional data ingestion system called feed pipes. It was fully engineered, accredited, documented, and designed for the pressures of a deployed environment. But when Ed arrived in Iraq, he found that this accredited system had been abandoned, replaced by an unauthorized tool. When he raised concerns about the data corruption, missing events, and timestamp failures, he encountered something far more troubling: leadership resistance and retaliation. Today, we're going to discuss three things: what happens when leaders refuse to listen, how a few unauthorized decisions compromised mission-critical data, and what happens when someone speaks up in a culture that doesn't want accountability. Let's begin. Ed, to begin, can you walk us through the context of the situation? Specifically, what was your role at the time? What system or mission were you responsible for? And who were the key individuals or teams involved leading up to the challenge that you encountered?
In 2007, I deployed as a senior software engineer supporting a Joint Intelligence Operations Center in Iraq. The JIAC was called. Our job was to ingest real-time battlefield data from various systems in theater, creating feeds around those systems for the JIAC. This data was used for mission planning purposes, for situational awareness, and for operational decisions. The core of the architecture for JIAC was called the Brain. It was a cluster of servers that handled massive amounts of data at scale. The accredited ingestion system component known as feed pipes was developed back at Fort Monmouth by the Army civilians and contractors there at the Software Integration Lab. I worked with a team of software integration specialists that put the system in a precarious position and made me question what was going on.
When you arrived in Iraq, what was the significant leadership or organizational challenge you discovered? And at what point did you realize it presented a risk to the mission or organizational integrity?
Good question. I was faced with an issue of having to continue work on a project in theater that was going down the wrong path and potentially putting the warfighter at serious risk. Upon arrival, I was provided documentation of the feed pipes ingestion architecture, which is the accredited software. I was also informed of another tool that they were using on JIAC called feed agents, something that was built in theater outside the purview of the software integration lab back at Fort Monmouth. I was told by the on-site team in Iraq that the accredited ingestion software did not work, and they built this other tool to make up for its shortcomings. My first assignment was to transform an existing data feed to another operational system in theater called Sydney. The Sydney Program Office provided JIAC a direct database feed to the Sydney database, which was no longer going to be supported. Sydney offered a new API using SOAP Web Services to access their data now, and I was tasked to write that new feed that integrated with the API versus the direct database feed that they had in place. The integration team wanted me to work with their homegrown application, which was not ready to use web services. The problem with that is I would have had to build the actual interface for the web service and the data feed along with that. However, knowing that feed pipes, in theory, already had a working web service feed, I asked why couldn't we just use that mechanism. They simply replied that it just wouldn't work. They also had this chip on their shoulder that the engineers at Sydney could not produce a standard SOAP web service, which further supported their idea that they needed a custom developed application to do that. So that's why they chose the feed agents software. I wasn't totally convinced by their arguments, and I saw nothing but red flags around this. I had just come from Germany, and I was told in Germany that I couldn't even put a compiler on a non-production system that was in use. I found out that the JIAC engineers had put compilers on the production servers and were actually building code on live servers to deploy this feed agent. To put it simply, having a compiler on a live server is probably one of the more dangerous things you can do in DoD software engineering. As you know, DoD takes cybersecurity very seriously. Current governing policy, the risk management framework, governs all the cybersecurity activities of a software system deployed to a DoD network. At the time, that RMF was known as Tkacz, the DoD Information Technology Security Certification and Accreditation Process. That was the governing security doctrine. I spent several hours learning about Tkacz while I was working on JIAC and learned all the different artifacts that went into getting JIAC accredited for the network. One of the main documents I ran into was the System Security Authorization Agreement. That document basically lays out the baseline configuration of the entire system. It also specifies rules of engagement. You can't put prohibited software on the system, you can't put compilers on there, so on and so forth. By doing what this team did in theater, they completely bypassed the entire Tkacz package, and really the system should have been taken offline at that point. But beyond the technical policy, I mean, you have another slew of problems with feed agents. First off, there's no version control. You can't really recreate what was changed. Secondly, there's no audit trail for what was done, who did it, why were they building this system, how does that fit into the grander scheme of the architecture of the system? None of that. There was a live instability now. You can crash a system that the troops are depending on for, pertinent intel data, real time. There's also a security exposure. If you have a compiler on a system, if somebody is able to hack into the system, they can run code on a production box and cause massive chaos. To give you an idea of how dangerous and reckless this activity is, I would compare it to trying to fix an airplane mid-flight with the wrong tools and the wrong expertise on hand. I'm all for fixing bad software, but there are ways of doing it that don't involve building a new system on a production server. This was just absolutely insane to me.
So Ed, when you recognized the unauthorized system and the risk it posed, what decision did you make about how to respond? What values, professional standards, or ethical frameworks guided your actions through that process?
I had to do a lot of research while I was there, and I had to reach out to a number of people on the program to kind of get the idea of what we were supposed to be doing. I received feedback from one high up that basically said, hey, feed agents isn't supposed to be used, it's not authorized, and it was a rogue operation. The guys that developed it had no authority to do so. So I had some concrete evidence through that alone. But no one in the office seemed to agree with that sentiment. They were just like, yeah, we don't care what the higher ups say. We were going to continue down this path, and we're going to keep doing what we're doing. I didn't know what to do. I spent a few weeks learning feed pipes. I was talking to the engineers back in the United States, learning the program. I was not going to be part of this other rogue operation where they were building this thing on a production server. It was just, I knew it was wrong. I was not going to touch that. So I kept the government aware of what was going on, but every time I talked to the government about what was going on, I would get slapped down by my corporate people. Somebody at corporate would be like, hey, you can't be doing that. Don't go to the government, go through your chain of command, go through our managers. I'm like, yeah, I've already done that. I'm not doing this anymore. You guys are going the wrong way, and I'm going to have to just veer off from that. So ethically, I knew that going to the government was going to be my best hope for getting anything changed on the program, because going through the people that were already on the program, they had already basically made their decision. We're sticking to this path. So I continued my work. I continued working on feed pipes and learning it and making sure that I built the best feed using the accredited software. But then something else came to my attention one day at the office. Somebody had submitted a trouble ticket for an event that was not having the right data. There was something wrong with the information in the event that was stored in the database. So I took a look at it, and I found something that was just completely astonishing. I found 3 events in the database from 2 different systems. It was the same event from 2 different systems, and the timestamp for when the incident occurred for each event was completely different. That threw a complete red flag for me because I knew that the warfighter was depending on this data to do analysis for intelligence operations. They really needed accurate data. When I saw that there was the same event in there 3 times with 3 different timestamps on when the event occurred, I had to bring it up to the government. There really was no telling how widespread the issue was. So that was my main concern. If it already happened once, it was going to happen elsewhere in the data. There was no doubt about it. So being 26, 27 years old at the time, my ethics were not with my team. I was more of there's a black and white kind of thing here. You follow the system accreditation and do it the way it's supposed to be done. I had a hard time coping with the idea that the Army had spent billions of dollars on this intelligence system and it was being completely Frankensteined out here in Iraq. And not only that, the soldiers and the warfighters and the analysts that were working out there were forced to use the system. They were mandated to use it. So the only ethical thing to do at the time was to really just speak up to the government. So I continued talking to the government about the problems that were occurring.
Leadership doesn't always respond well to difficult information. How did leaders react when you raised your concerns? And what do you think drove that reaction? Pride, fear of accountability, organizational politics, or something else?
Well, they became very defensive. They seemed to be emotionally invested in this unauthorized system that they built. And they didn't really want the Army to know that that was going on. I was told not to speak to government leadership and stop reporting technical issues. After I informed the government of the previous incident with the multiple events having wrong timestamps, my company asked me to come back to the United States, and I resigned on the spot. I hope that my brutal honesty regarding the problems with the system and my removal would push them to fix things, that it would get up to a higher level and people would start looking at it. About a week later, I received an email inadvertently. Somebody had CC'd me on an email, and they were basically saying, oh, hey, we heard about this guy Ed. We're going to clean up whatever mess he made. So to me, I knew what that meant. The tone was basically, I was the problem child. Everything was fine. So I knew that nothing was going to get fixed out there. That left me with nothing but a nuclear option to file a complaint with the Department of Justice regarding this behavior out there. Because I was concerned that eventually somebody would get hurt or killed by improperly using the system. In my opinion, the team at Fort Monmouth did things right. They built the feed pipe software under disciplined processes. They had a thorough testing lab there. The accreditation set the bounds for how the feed pipe software would work. It was great software. It had all the proper contingencies built into it. The team in Iraq just did not give it its due. And out of pride, they developed this other system to show that, hey, we're the guys running the show out here. We know what we're doing. We're not going to listen to the lab back in New Music. So that was what happened.
And finally, how has this experience shaped the way you lead today? Are there specific behaviors or principles you now prioritize because of what you lived through in this situation?
This experience taught me that leadership is tested when truth becomes inconvenient. The Fort Monmouth team built something extraordinary. Their engineering was rock solid, but in Iraq, a small group of people tried to undermine that work through shortcuts and denial. The lawsuit that followed was an interesting experience and gave me hope that there were people out there trying to do the right thing. I was talking to agents at the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. I had spoke with a gentleman from Army CID. I also had to talk with DOJ attorneys about what was going on. I was even in a meeting once with Steve Linick describing the problems I experienced in Iraq. Mr. Linick would go on to serve under Hillary Clinton's Department of State as the IG. The lesson is simple. A well-built system collapses when leadership allows a culture that silences the truth. If leaders don't protect integrity, the mission will pay the price.
As we close, it's important to recognize an interesting moment in the timeline. 2 years after Ed filed his complaint with the DOJ, Wired published an article titled Brain Damage. Army says its software mine is not survivable. In that 2012 article, the Army's flagship intelligence system, DCGS-A, was criticized for complexity, usability problems, and a broader system-level issue. But it's crucial to state clearly, Ed's findings were unrelated to the issues discussed in that Wired article. His concerns centered on one specific unauthorized tool, dangerous modifications to production systems, and data integrity failures specific to the deployed environment. Still, both stories, Ed's and the Wired article, point to the same truth. Technology can be brilliant, but leadership determines whether that brilliance is preserved. Still, both stories, Ed's and the Wired article, point to the same truth. Technology can be brilliant, but leadership determines whether that brilliance is preserved or wasted. Thank you, Ed, for your shared experience. And thank you to everyone listening for joining us in this important conversation about leadership, accountability, and the human factors that shape mission success.